Hello everybody and welcome back to a brand new video. Today we're going to be doing the President Hamilton timeline, episode 6. We're going to be going through the years of 1902 to 1922. And before we get started, I'd like to make a little change as some people down in the comment section below had to inform me, correct me. William Jennings Bryan would not pass the Gold Standard Act. He would actually pass more so of a Free Silver Act. So that's the only major change, and that's going to affect the country in a way that there would be a major inflation, a very slow inflation rate that will only get worse once World War I begins. Well, coincidentally, I guess you could say, as it only gets worse around that time. And we'll explain more as we get on toward that time. But 1902 would have the Coal Strike Act of 1902, when President Bryan would pass the Newlands Reclamation Act, which would give states funding for, interior funding, pretty much. 1903, the Oxford Strike of 1903, which this would lead directly to President Bryan creating the Department of Commerce and Labor, and we would also have the Hepner Flood of 1903. 1904, we'd have the Great Baltimore Fire, the Eden train wreck, the New Market train wreck, and then in 1904, we would have Republican General Theodore Roosevelt, or I should say governor, not general, excuse me, and he would defeat Federalist Judge Alton Parker, 371 to 108, to become the 22nd president. So Theodore Roosevelt would run in this timeline. I would presume he would get Bryan's endorsement during the nomination process, which is why he would get the nomination. I could see that in this timeline. Going on to 1905, the Chicago Teamster Strike, as well as President Roosevelt mediating the Treaty of Portsmouth between Russia and Japan. 1906, we have the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, which caused a massive landslide. President Roosevelt would sign the Antiquities Act. Don't know how you pronounce that. As well as he would pass the Meat Inspection Act, as well as the Pure Food and Drug Act, as well as we had the Atlanta race riots. 1907, we'd have the Panic of 1907. It's a little bit worse in this timeline due to the whole inflation, due to free silver, but it doesn't really hurt Roosevelt at all. We also have the Manga mining disaster. 1908, we would have the Springfield race riot of 1908, and this election would be a bit weird. You might be thinking, why is this happening? William Taft would be a Federalist in this timeline, as the Federalist Party is always the party of the big nobles kind of guy, and the Republicans are the Populist Party. So we have the Populists versus the elites. And Taft was more so an elitist politician. And Taft and Roosevelt would have never worked together, since Taft is not a Republican, he's a Federalist in this timeline, so these two would be at neck and neck, would be at odds with one another. And so Roosevelt would defeat Taft 349 to 137 to win re-election, and Taft would never be the Secretary of War under William McKinley nor Theodore Roosevelt. From 1909, 1910, and 1911, there is nothing noteworthy. I've got gum, if that's what you guys are. If you guys hear something in my mouth, that's gum. 1912, we have the next election. 1912, we have Republican Senator Robert LaFollette defeating Federalist Governor Woodrow Wilson, 337 to 197, to become the 23rd president. Roosevelt would be super popular, and whoever succeeded him in this timeline going to be Robert LaFollette. They would pretty much win no matter what, but Woodrow Wilson would still put up a good fight, though he'd still lose. He only won 42% of the vote in our timeline on the four-way split, and there is no four-way split this time around, due to Taft not being president and Roosevelt actually being president. So there you go. 1913, LaFollette would actually pass two amendments. The Income Tax Amendment as well as the Elected Senators Amendment. Those two are ratified now. We would also have the Indianapolis streetcar strike of 1913 and the Great Lakes Storm of 1913. Going on to 1914, we have the Ludlow Massacre. 1915, another amendment would be ratified under President LaFollette, and that's the 18th Amendment, which is women's suffrage. This is something that he would propose due to the women's suffrage amendment. He would propose this during his time as a senator, and he would run on this during his campaign for president. In the late 1910s, the inflation crisis begins, or the inflation recession, the late 1910s. So from 1915 to 1920, we have this huge problem with inflation and all that, and the recession, which is why the United States is not getting involved in World War I. We become neutral, And President LaFollette would pass the Keatings-Owen Act, which is the first law restricting child labor. He would also sign the Merchant Marine Act of 1916, which establishes the U.S. Shipping Board. Going on to the 1960 election, the Federalist Governor Thomas Marshall, who was the running mate of Woodrow Wilson 4 years earlier, runs this time, and he defeats President Robert LaFollette 408 to 126, pretty much defeating him in a giant landslide, becoming the 24th president. Follette would not be popular due to the whole inflation crisis happening, though he would actually pin this on his successors, both Roosevelt and Bryan, which both of them abandoned him during the campaigning process. And they're not endorsing Marshall, they're just not endorsing anybody. Going on to 1917, the first thing President Marshall does when he gets in office is revoking the Free Silver Act. So that is gone, though he doesn't establish a Gold Standard Act. Let me know if you think the Federalist Party would evoke the Gold Standard Act, a more quote-unquote modern-time Gold Standard Act. Let me know down in the comments. But he would also declare that the United States would be neutral in World War I, or the Great War as it was called at the time. We would also have the New York City flood riot of 1917 and the Great Atlantic Fire of 1917. In 1918, we have the Great Train Wreck of 1918. Going on to 1919, the Boston Molasses disaster, and President Marshall would actually ratify an amendment in this year, which is the Prohibition Amendment. That's the 19th, so Prohibition and women's suffrage kind of flip in this timeline. We would also have the Boston telephone strike of 1919 and the Chicago race riot of 1919. Going on to 1920, as you can see, there's a note down there in the bottom. World War I ends in a stalemate, so that means imperialism doesn't take note. We still have these monarchy-esque countries in Germany. Though the German Revolution might still happen due to it ending in a stalemate and the war lasting longer. So we might see a democracy, a form of democracy form in Germany, maybe a constitutional monarchy where the Kaiser still reigns, but there's a parliament. You might see something like that. However, the Soviet Union still does rise over there in Russia, as they're already out of the war by then. The Slavics, I think they were called, will still take over in Russia, so we'd still have this form of the Leninism and Stalinism and Trotskyism and all that. The Oahu sugar strike of 1920, that goes down there in Hawaii, is a place that's not a state yet. And going into the 1920 election, where Republicans nominate the Secretary of War under both Teddy Roosevelt and Robert LaFollette, who served for 12 years, which is Franklin Roosevelt, a very young Franklin Roosevelt compared to what he was when he started running for president, I think 20 years later. But he would run, and he would end up losing to Thomas Marshall, who was very popular, as he would get the economy back to where it was before even William Jennings Bryan, as the economy actually started slowly but surely lowering over the past, let's say, 16, 20 years, over the past 20 years. The economy is as high as it's ever been in 20 years, so he's very popular about that. And Franklin Roosevelt, of course, I don't think he was paralyzed at this time, though he wouldn't have done a good campaign if the 1920 election with him and James Cox says anything, so he wouldn't campaign well, as you can see by the map here. He would actually do better than Robert LaFollette did, but Roosevelt, just on namesake alone of Theodore Roosevelt, wouldn't win. So Thomas Marshall would win re-election, and again, World War I went in a stalemate. Going on to 1921, President Marshall would pass the Emergency Quota Act, which sets regulations on European immigration. And in 1922, there is nothing noteworthy. And thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, do you think the Federalist, Thomas Marshall, would establish a Gold Standard Act during his last term? Or some sort of micro-managing the economy act, something like that. Your ideas are welcome. Also, go follow my Twitter at Chaotic Politics. This is the Chaotic One saying, peace.